On this Sunday night, the new narrative being pushed by the Russian president. Putin's new rhetoric and warning to the Russian people as fierce fighting escalates on the first anniversary of Russia's invasion.
His major goal with this speech was to convince a domestic audience that he was justified in his war against Ukraine.
Plus, witnesses to war.
In a lot of ways, it's harder because the grief and the horror of what's been happening there has just been building.
How our correspondents and crew members are reflecting after what they saw on the ground in Ukraine. From she-cession to she-covery, why women are flooding into the workforce. Honoring acting icon Gordon Pinsent.
Finding the center of your story, the beating heart of it. That's what makes a reporter.
Looking back at the Canadian pioneer's prolific 7 decades on the big screen.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. As Russian forces ramp up the offensive 1 year since the start of the war, the Russian president is also ramping up his rhetoric, suggesting the West wants to completely dismantle Russia. We're going to get to his comments in a moment, but first we want to begin tonight in eastern Ukraine and in the strategic city of Bakhmut, a place Russian forces have been trying to encircle for months. Now, Russia is claiming to have captured a key village near the city as an anniversary present. But the reality on the ground might be a different story. Bakhmut has seen some of the fiercest fighting since the war began. This new drone video you're watching was published today by Russian state media. It shows a scene of total devastation. But according to Kyiv, Ukraine is still in control of the strategic city. And it says that Russia's new offensive has so far been unsuccessful. Here's what we know to be true. The fighting in and around Bakhmut has been relentless for each inch of territory, and the casualties high on both sides. And as the war enters its second year, Putin has a new message for the Russian people, filled with specific accusations against the West. Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight.
The front lines in the Donbass, an almost lunar landscape scarred by war. In this nearby coal mining town, Ukrainian troops defend what's left. And who's left? It's 9 days since my sister died, says this woman. Emilia is one of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians that Vladimir Putin claims to be attempting to liberate. In an interview on Russian state TV, Putin again lashed out at the West for supporting Ukraine. He says part of the reason he recently suspended his country's participation in the New START nuclear treaty with the United States was because of NATO's combined nuclear capabilities, referencing the nuclear weapons held by France and the UK.
His major goal with this speech was to convince a domestic audience that he was justified in his war against Ukraine.
Putin claims the West wants to see his country broken up and dismantled if Russia loses the war, suggesting to Russians their future as a distinct sovereign people would be threatened.
There have been some Western analysts recently worrying about what might happen if Russia loses this war disastrously. Could the country break up? And Putin seized on that comment as evidence that that was actually Washington's secret goal.
U.S. President Joe Biden stated just the opposite this past week.
The United States and the nations of Europe do not seek to control or destroy Russia.
Saudi Arabia's foreign minister visited Kyiv Sunday. Saudi leadership says it wants to see a diplomatic resolution to the fighting. But Ukrainians will remind outsiders that for them this war is now entering its 10th year. Sunday is Ukraine's annual day of resistance to the occupation of Crimea, marking Russia's annexation of the peninsula in 2014. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
In the first days of last year's invasion, the Ukrainian city of Kherson fell. The Russian-speaking Ukrainian city was the only regional capital to be captured by Moscow. But in November, the Ukrainian military took the city back, and that was thanks in part to an underground resistance that was led by ordinary civilians. Jeff Semple tells that story from Kherson.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine isn't going as planned, but capturing Kherson was perhaps the Kremlin's most significant victory. On March 2nd, the Russian military took control of the southern city, and Vladimir Putin claimed it would remain part of Russia forever. But Lilia Alexandrova had other plans. The stay-at-home mother of three doesn't look like your stereotypical resistance leader, but that may have helped her evade detection. Russian vehicles patrolled the street outside her apartment, but after dark she would sneak out, armed with a can of spray paint.
There you go. Ukrainian flag.
Alexandrova secretly painted Ukrainian flags all around her Russian-occupied neighborhood. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding. I was so nervous, she says, but I knew that God would protect us because I was doing the right thing. When the Russians covered up her work, she would make her mark again, and again, and again.
You're very brave.
And courage can be contagious. Before long, she started seeing markings from others. One of the most common symbols, a yellow ribbon. The yellow ribbon united us and showed that we were against the Russians and that we were waiting for the armed forces of Ukraine to liberate our city, she says.
But what began as a silent, largely symbolic protest quickly evolved into a full-blown underground resistance.
Yellow ribbon, it's biggest movement.
Alex, whose identity we're protecting, is an IT worker turned civil resistance leader. In the first weeks of the occupation, he says, they organized secret meetings and even anti-Russian protests, provoking a fierce crackdown from the Russian occupiers. One protester, a woman in her 70s, was killed. Other activists were arrested. Alex says their whereabouts are still unknown. We showed the Russians that the Ukrainian people are against them, he says, and the way the Russians responded showed us that they were afraid.
Mostly it was Kherson.
This activist in Odessa, a few hours west, organized secret evacuations to get women and children out of Kherson. Their buses forced to cross dozens of Russian checkpoints.
It was a real nightmare because any time they could stop you, they could rob you, and they could send you back. We were lucky that they didn't check us thoroughly and they just let us through.
But eventually, he says, the Russians confiscated some of their buses, while another was hit by shelling.
And after that, all evacuation stopped.
Meanwhile, as Russia was holding sham referendums on annexation in Kherson and other occupied territories, Yellow Ribbon members were secretly sending information about Russian activities and positions to the Ukrainian military. I collected as much information and photos as possible, piece by piece, and then sent them the coordinates, Alexandrova says. Then, in November, after 8 months under occupation, the day she'd been praying for finally came. Kherson was liberated, the Russians retreating a few kilometers across the river, sparking celebrations in the streets. And the Yellow Ribbon movement isn't done yet. It now counts more than 4,000 members, applying hard-learned lessons to other occupied territories in Ukraine, hoping for a similar outcome. The Russians don't belong here, she says. Kherson is Ukraine. Jeff Semple, Global News, Kherson.
In the 12 months since the war began in Ukraine, the Russian military has suffered setback after setback. And the same impact was expected for the Russian economy. Western sanctions were supposed to bring the country to its knees. But within weeks, as Eric Sorensen reports, the Russian economy started to rebound, despite being hit hard by Western isolation.
The Moskvich is back. This was a Renault factory till last year, but like so many Western companies, the French automaker pulled up stakes over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Russia nationalized the plant, and it now produces the Moskvich, a brand from the old Soviet days. Some thought everything would collapse, said President Vladimir Putin this month. Nothing is falling apart. Our domestic manufacturers now have opportunities. Hardship was expected to come from global sanctions designed to punish Russia.
Is adopted.
The United Nations voted this week once more overwhelmingly to denounce the invasion. But just how isolated has the war left Russia? Like the UN vote last year, 141 countries demanded Russia withdraw from Ukraine. only 7, including Russia, voted against. But there were also more than 30 abstentions, many African countries, plus India and China. Those two countries, with over 35% of the world's population, have not shunned Russia. Russian oil exports to China soared to 2 million barrels a day last month, and to India, 1.4 million barrels a day, a record high. Whether selling energy to China and India, or buying military drones from Iran or artillery shells from North Korea, Russia can still find partners to help both its economy and its military. President Putin met with a top Chinese official this week, a message to the world that Russia has friends. China is building new pipelines to transport Russian gas from Siberia, and Putin is strengthening relationships with the so-called Global South.
You can think of the use of sanctions as being perhaps weakening Russia in the very long term. But in terms of altering behavior right now, no, it's not going to have any impact.
Back at home, old Russian brands like Kama bicycles are having a revival. I used to ride a Kama, says Tatiana. I feel positive for our producers. Most Russians, says one Moscow-based pollster, are adapting to a more Russified economy.
They don't think about the direct influence of the sanctions. Or us, we are strong and we can stand everything.
The Moscovich wasn't very popular back in the old Soviet days, but in a time of economic sanctions, consumers have no choice but to consider Russian brands that they once turned away from. Eric Sorensen, Global News.
The she-covery is here. Coming up, how women are leading Canada's economic recovery. It's easy to remember how the COVID-19 pandemic greatly impacted the economy, shuttering businesses and affecting jobs. Yet these days, the number of women in the workforce has never been higher, and it's leading to an economic rebound some are even calling a she-covery. Anne Gaviola explains.
Throwing an axe instead of throwing in the towel. Melissa Harrod's business is open 365 days a year, and this mom is busy.
It's a constant juggling, really. I think that's probably a pretty similar situation for most parents.
She and her partner make it work.
Both of us are capable of making the meals and getting the kids ready for school and getting the kids to school and putting them to bed.
These days, business is thriving, but back in 2021, lockdowns and school closures were a constant source of stress. She, like many women, had to do double duty. Many forced out of their jobs, either because their industry was negatively impacted or because the demands of home and work became too much.
We saw 3 times more unemployed women than we saw before the pandemic. There were less women participating in the labor force.
Today, things are different. According to Statistics Canada, the employment rate of women in their prime working years has hit record highs, doing the heaviest lift. In fact, women are now leading the recovery, a trend known as a she-covery. But the burden of household tasks, elder care and childminding still disproportionately falls on women. Experts say the affordable childcare deals Ottawa has inked with provinces can help more women get into and stay in the workforce.
The affordability piece has been a challenge for many women. It's a reason why many of them choose to stay at home. Well, they don't feel that they have a choice, and even if they can afford it, there aren't enough spots. So this is a big step forward.
Employers can do their part to keep women in the labor pool.
Flexible work is a double-edged sword.
But steps need to be taken to ensure flexible arrangements don't penalize women's careers in the long run.
Sometimes these flexible work policies are seen as an accommodation specifically for women and specifically for mothers.
Keeping women and working parents on the job is an economic necessity now and in the future.
We need as much women as we can on the workforce, especially if you tie in the fact that aging population usually need a bit more services, and service industries, as you know, rely heavily on women employment.
A sustainable economic recovery is a she-covery. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Ahead, behind the scenes, covering a war. 1 year into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, our correspondents pull back the curtain on what it felt like to be on the ground. Since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Global News correspondents and photojournalists have been traveling to the region to bring you the stories of the people forever changed by the war. Their job has been to document history. But of course, they are human too. So on this one-year anniversary of the conflict, we asked them to share some of the experiences that may not have made it on the news.
Once you've done it once or twice, you know what to expect. But in a lot of ways, it's harder because, you know, the grief and the horror of what's been happening there has just been building for a year.
For a few days, we were stuck in Poland trying to get into Lviv, Ukraine. And I just remember the busload and busload and busload of people.
It was hard not to be struck by these people who were moving out of danger, going somewhere. They just literally didn't know where.
It was just mother after mother with their kids, and you're just like, these kids likely won't see their father again, and she won't see her husband.
I remember the platform of the train station being so packed with people, it was difficult to move. We found a woman and talked to her, and she had a couple kids with her. She was trying to get onto the train, and it was just packed. She was able to sit by a window and look at her husband and kind of give the goodbyes and the hands up on the window, and it was heartbreaking. I try not to let these stories affect me too much, but this one did. It was hard to watch, and it wasn't until the train left that it hit me, and I broke down and cried. It was, and that doesn't happen very often for me, so it was quite an experience.
One of the interesting things was to see these refugees moving from Lviv, from Western Ukraine, into Poland.
At the biggest processing center they had for all the refugees. Out of nowhere, we hear this piano, and I was figuring it was over the loudspeaker, but it was actually a guy that would put a piano in the back of a truck. Once the war started, he drove right to the border to entertain the refugees, and it was quite phenomenal.
People would be standing with signs trying to bring people into their apartments and things like that. That was a sort of the heartwarming part.
Everywhere in Ukraine is so different. So as soon as you show up in Lviv, people are in the streets, eating at cafes, doing whatever they would do in normal times. You get to Kiev and things are a bit more unsettled, and then you go south to Mykolaiv or into Kharkiv, and it is a war zone. It's actively being shelled, and people are scared.
Hearing the air raid sirens for the first time, that really, again, hits you. It's a feeling I've never experienced before. And then when it was time to actually enter, you know, the frontline cities, you cross a checkpoint and you have to put your body armor on, and you can hear the artillery blasts going off.
One of the most sad things to realize is that people can get used to living under these kind of conditions.
In the early days of the war, there was, you know, the grief was just visceral. You know, people were terrified. They were angry.
After a year of air sirens and missile strikes and now drone attacks and being called fascists and Nazis by Putin, I think people are just really tired.
Next, saying goodbye to the actor who personified Canadian kindness. How Gordon Pinsent is being remembered tonight. Canadian artists are mourning the loss of an acting legend tonight. Gordon Pinsent was known for a wide range of beloved roles through his 70-year career, from voicing the gentle elephant Babar to his heartbreaking role in Away From Her. He passed away this weekend at the age of 92. Tonight, our Mike Drolet looks back at Pinsent's legacy and how he inspired fellow artists along the way.
How do you pick a defining moment from a career 7 decades long?
Finding the center of your story, the beating heart of it, that's what makes a reporter.
For the latter stages of Gordon Pinsent's storied career, it could be his award-winning turns in the movies, like Away From Her.
I'm your husband. We've been married for 45 years.
Pinsent found the beating heart in almost everything he did, and he did it with a grace that's rare in the acting world. Director Sarah Polley remembers him for his twinkle of mischief and a determination to enjoy the moment. And boy, did he ever. He was a standout among eccentrics on the Red Green Show.
Oh, women are attracted to me, Red. They find me mysterious.
And who can forget his Shakespearean performance of Justin Bieber's teenage autobiography?
Singers aren't supposed to have dairy before a show. But we all know I'm a rule breaker. Pizza is just so good.
Born in Grand Falls, Newfoundland, Pinsent found success in Hollywood, with roles in the original Thomas Crown Affair and Hogan's Heroes, but said it left him stifled creatively.
I felt being taken over quite easily, in fact. And I was there 6 years, and I can't believe it was that long.
So he came home and extended his talents across stage and screen for veteran collaborators and newcomers alike. When then fledgling director Jeremy Lalonde was casting his film Sex After Kids, he reached out to Pinsent on a whim, expecting nothing. Not only did Pinsent star in the film, they became friends.
It didn't matter that we had like a crew of maybe 10 people. You know, he acted as if we were like the biggest movie in the world shooting that time.
My God. Not every role across 7 decades was an award winner, but his range...
This is a very peculiar situation.
Yes, he was the voice of Babar too, was boundless. He simply embraced every role with grace, a sense of humor, and his Newfoundland charm.
For someone who, you know, spent most of his career here, I don't think there's a bigger icon or legend than Gordon Pinsent.
Gordon Pinsent was 92.
What a career. That's Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Farah Nasser. On behalf of our whole crew, I want to thank you for spending time with us. And in honor of Gordon Pinsent, we want to leave you with a view from the province where he was born and raised. So tonight's Your Canada is the Exploits River, which runs through Gordon Pinsent's hometown of Grand Falls, Windsor, Newfoundland and Labrador. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.